Welcome to ERU's monthly Global Outlook video, where we look at some of the trends affecting economies around the world. Today, we're going to talk about the outlook for Europe's economy and the policy outlook as well in the wake of the European Parliament elections and in the run-up to the US presidential election. I'm joined today by Agnese Ortolani, who is our principal economist for Europe, and I'm Emily Mansfield, regional director for Europe. So, Agnese, to start, it seems like there's some slightly stronger momentum at the moment in the European economy after a pretty challenging 2023. What's the outlook for later this year?
So real GDP in both the Eurozone and the EU grew by 0.3% on a quarterly basis in the second quarter, with most EU economies continuing their gradual recovery. And Spain in particular exceeded expectation. And alongside other Southern European economies like Greece and Portugal, Spain is set to enjoy one of the fastest growth rates in the region this year, supported by a buoyant tourism sector. On a more negative note, the German economy contracted in the second quarter on the back of weak investment and sluggish manufacturing demand. Germany has barely seen any growth since the COVID recession, and we expect it to be the slowest growing large economy in the world this year, after a GDP contraction last year. All in all, we expect the EU economy to expand by about 1% this year, which is above last year's growth rates, but still behind that of the US, with Europe already lagging the US in its rebound from the pandemic. And this slightly better performance of the EU economy this year will be mainly driven by stronger private consumption on the back of declining inflation and still strong wage growth and stronger demand for EU exports. But risks are now on the downside. Monthly indicators are still pointing to a struggling industrial sector, and economic sentiment in the EU declined sharply in August on the back of increased uncertainty about the economic outlook for the region, especially as the US economy shows some weakness and the November US presidential election approaches.
Now, the US presidential election in November, it's going to be very consequential for Europe. It's also going to be very, very close. Our core forecast is that Donald Trump, the Republican candidate, will win the election. And we're in the process of revising down our forecast to take into account the impact of US trade tariffs, EU counter tariffs, and higher trade policy uncertainty. Agnese, can you talk us through what this might mean for Europe?
As you said, Emily, our core forecasts now assume that under Trump, US tariffs on imports will increase from 2% currently to about 5 to 10% from late 2025, and that the EU will respond with the targeted retaliatory tariffs probably in early 2026. So trade policy uncertainty will start to weigh on European business sentiment and investment from next year, with export growth and industrial production suffering mostly in 2026. Germany, Europe's largest economy, is the most exposed to US tariffs, owing to its large trade surplus with the US and also the openness of its economy. And a Trump scenario would cut 1.2 percentage points from Germany's growth in total in 2025-2027, with Germany GDP growing less than 1% in those years. Ireland, Italy, and the open Nordic economies are also among the most exposed to a potential US-EU trade war, while the UK, Central Europe, and Southern Eastern Europe are less exposed. And all in all, we expect the EU economy to expand by 1.7% in 2025-2028 on the back of easing financing conditions as the European Central Bank gradually cut interest rates. However, a further expansion in economic growth will be prevented by the looming US-EU trade war, with the EU likely to be hit harder than the US given its higher reliance on exports.
So that's quite a hit potentially to European growth should Donald Trump win the election, and upside risks should Kamala Harris win instead. Now, one of the big elections this year in Europe was, of course, the European Parliament elections, and we've just seen Ursula von der Leyen re-elected as well as European Commission President. What's the outlook for EU policy now moving forwards?
So the Greens' vote were crucial to get von der Leyen re-elected by EU lawmakers, as they helped to counter defections from the three centrist pro-EU groups at the secret ballot. This means that von der Leyen will have to make concessions to Green parties on green policy to be able to pass her legislative agenda, and also that far-right Eurosceptic parties will largely remain excluded from EU parliamentary majorities, despite a right-wing shift in the European Parliament since the June EU election. And for the next Commission, the key policy focus will be on competitiveness, industrial policy, and defense, especially in the context of looming trade wars and increased economic competition from the US and China. So green legislation will not be scrapped, but the focus will shift towards implementing existing regulations and supporting EU industries to meet green targets. In terms of the next steps, EU member states are now putting forward their candidates for their commissioners' posts, which will be approved by von der Leyen before the end of September, and the European Parliament will then have to approve the entire College of Commissioners, most likely in November, before the official inauguration of the new Commission will be held on December 1st.
Okay, so don't expect much movement on the EU policy front in the next few months at least. We've got much more on all of these topics and more on our Viewpoint platform, so do explore further. Thank you very much, Agnese, for joining me. Thank you for listening.